See that? So let me know if there's a problem. And I'm going to speak to you for the next little while about Nuwiq and its role in treating hemophilia A in Canada. And first I want to let you know that this event is being supported by Octapharma. I am not presenting on behalf of Octapharma. I'm not employed by the company. So what I'm going to speak to you about is my own presentation. It's my own opinions and my own interpretations. It's possible I may be referring to products or treatment regimens that aren't yet approved in Canada. And finally, I want to let you know that I have served in various consultancy roles and have accepted honoraria from companies including Octapharma. So with that, I will go on to give you some background. Now, let me ask you to be patient with me because I'm going to spend about half the time giving you background information, which I think is important for you to understand the potential value of Nuwiq. So I'm going to spend as much time giving you this background as I am talking about the product itself. So let's start. This is what I'm referring to as the recent history of hemophilia replacement therapy. For some of you, 1993 is ancient history. For me, it's recent history. And that's when we first had access to what we call first-generation, full-length, recombinant, as well as highly purified plasma-derived factor VIII concentrates. And in the ensuing years, more than 20 years, between 1993 and today, we've had some advances, most of which have been pretty modest. So first was the removal of albumin, which is a plasma protein from the formulation of concentrates. This led to what's called second-generation concentrates. Then human and animal plasma proteins were removed from the culture media and the purification step. That's what led to what we call third-generation products. Then we had the introduction of the first B-domain deleted factor VIII concentrate. That was Refacto, which was succeeded by Zinta. Some of you will know that product. We now, as you know, can store products at room temperature. We've got more vial sizes. We have reduced reconstitution volume. And finally, we have the extended half-life products. Okay, and that first extended half-life factor VIII product is a product called Eloctate, which some of you will know about. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my slide. There we go. So these advances have addressed convenience and safety from transfusion-transmitted infections, which were obviously critical advances. So what's left to be addressed? What are the remaining goals? And these are some of the major ones. First of all, we want to further enhance protection from bleeds and from resultant joint damage. And one approach to do this is to use longer-acting and or more potent treatment products. The second one I've listed is to improve safety with respect to inhibitor development. This is the major remaining complication of hemophilia care is factor VIII inhibitors. One approach would be to use less immunogenic products. That means less products which are less likely to excite an immune response. We can use factor VIII bypassing treatments, meaning treatments other than factor VIII. And we can try to manipulate the individual's immune system to reduce his immune response. The third goal is to reduce or eliminate the need for frequent infusions. And we can do that by trying to develop longer-acting treatment products. And finally, the fourth goal is to eliminate the need for intravenous infusions altogether, either by using novel formulations of products or, again, some products which are not factor VIII and which can be given by methods other than intravenous administration. So what I want to do first, so I go back, is to address the first two. So I want to talk about protection from bleeds and then protection from inhibitor agents. So first of all, bleeding. So I'm showing you some data from two papers published in recent years. The one on top is not a treatment study. This is an observational study from the Netherlands showing what Mother Nature has provided for us. And what this shows is that people with hemophilia whose factor VIII levels are fairly high, and if you look at the x-axis, that is the horizontal axis, you can see that people who have factor VIII levels above about 12 or 15% have virtually no bleeding, at least no spontaneous bleeding. So that's what we learned from observing nature. Now look at the bottom picture on the bottom left. A lot of you will remember this very important prophylaxis study published a few years ago. Marilyn Manco Johnson from Colorado was the prime author in that. And what this shows, in short, is those two very small bars that you see in the blue, dark and light blue. That's the number of bleeds after 4 and 5 years on study in patients who are on prophylaxis, which maintained a higher factor VIII level, than patients who are on on-demand treatment, and those are the tan or gold bars showing much higher bleed. So if we look at what prophylactic treatment taught us and what Mother Nature taught us, the conclusion is there should be a trough level, that is a minimal factor VIII level, during prophylaxis that will completely eliminate bleeding, or at least spontaneous bleeding. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point is about factor VIII inhibitors. And here's two very high-profile studies, and a lot of you are aware of both of these in recent years. So the top one is a table that I put together from the data published in what was called the Rodin study. You'll remember that was an important study. It was released in 2013. And what this showed is that the inhibitor development in patients treated with recombinant concentrates, that's on the left-hand side, compared to plasma-derived concentrates were about the same. You can see 30.4% for recombinant concentrates and about the same, 33% for plasma-derived concentrates. This shows the same thing for high-titer inhibitors, about the same. But what this study also showed was that second-generation recombinant factor VIII concentrates were associated with a higher inhibitor risk than third-generation products. In other words, there still is a difference between different products. Now, these two graphs on the bottom are from a study published just this year. This is a very important one called SIPPET, and a lot of you have heard about the SIPPET trial. Unlike Rodin, this was actually a randomized trial in which individuals were randomized to receive either plasma-derived or recombinant factor VIII. These were previously untreated patients, and what this showed is you can see these two curves are separated, meaning recombinant factor VIII concentrate considerably higher inhibitor risk than plasma-derived concentrate. The same thing is shown if you look only at the high-titer inhibitors. So there is a difference between products. And that's an important point to remember. There's only so much we can do to manipulate the immune system, and we certainly can't change what nature gave you, but we can manipulate the products. So why would someone even consider switching a factor VIII concentrate? And I think the top reason always has to be safety. If there's a safety concern about a concentrate, then you want to switch to a safer one. And that was the situation in the early 1990s when we went to recombinant, first-generation recombinant factor VIII concentrates. Another one which we have to acknowledge is product availability and cost. When we're in an environment like Canada where product is provided through either the Canadian Blood Services or Hemophilia A, then all we can have available to us is what is made available to us by the blood system. And cost figures in. It's not obviously the only or even the major reason for choosing a product, but when CBS and Hemophilia A choose products, that is an important consideration. Other reasons would be quality of life and convenience. So, for example, you may find that you have you find one infusion set more user-friendly than the infusion product. You might appreciate the vial sizes available from one product rather than the other. So these are important considerations. And another one would be individual preference for perceived efficacy. So some of you will tell us, look, product A just doesn't work as well for me as product B does. We often won't know why that is. We won't have a good explanation, but if you tell us that, then we have to acknowledge that that would be a good reason for switching to a product. And finally, importantly, particularly now when we've got so many new products coming online, participation in clinical trials is going to be an important incentive for many of you to consider switching in order to enroll in a clinical trial. So now, first, all the background, so be patient with me. We're going to get to Nuwiq very shortly, but you have to understand a little bit about the structure of factor VIII. So this is what factor VIII looks like in its structure. There's two chains here. This is called the heavy chain because it's bigger than this chain, which is the light chain. Now, you'll see that there are three letters here, A, B, C. These are the different domains, as they're called, of the molecule. And this part of the molecule called the B domain, which is a big chunk of the factor VIII molecule, that actually doesn't have any function after the factor VIII is secreted from the cell into the blood. And it's actually removed when factor VIII goes into action to help form a clot. So this is what we call full-length factor VIII, and this is B domain deleted factor VIII. And because the B domain doesn't have any function in the blood, many of the manufacturers are now producing factor VIII which doesn't come with the B domain at all, and it doesn't impair the function whatsoever. Now, what about producing a recombinant human protein like factor VIII? Why don't we make recombinant factor VIII in cells that are easy to get, cells derived from bacteria or yeast or fungi or insects or plants? The reason is that although these cells can accurately string together the building blocks of a protein like factor VIII, they could make that whole ABC structure that I showed you, they could make that, but only cells that come from mammals can modify those proteins properly. And these modifications are referred to as post-translational modifications, meaning after the primary structure of factor VIII has been made. These post-translational modifications are specific to species and even to organs within the species. Now, despite this fact, which we know, most factor VIII concentrates that you have used since 1993, that means most recombinant factor VIII concentrates that you have used, are produced in cells derived from rodents, specifically the ovaries or kidneys of hamsters. Now, people are not just big rodents, and there are differences. So what about these post-translational modifications? Why are they important? Well, accurate post-translational modification is necessary for the normal function of the protein, specifically for the stability of the protein, for it to be folded properly. These are very elaborate three-dimensional structures, and for the function. Secondly, it may be relevant to the risk of inducing an immune response. In other words, for factor VIII, that means that accurate post-translational modification may reduce the risk of forming a factor VIII inhibitor. And we know that there are data showing a greater risk of inhibitors with hamster cell-derived recombinant factor VIII compared to plasma-derived factor VIII concentrates. And that was the data I showed you from the SIPET study. So now we don't know for a fact that it's because it was derived from hamster cells that recombinant factor VIII looked more risky than plasma-derived factor VIII in the SIPET study, but that's possible.
You get him a hot dog?
So I've told you about post-translational modifications. What do they actually look like? So this is a cartoon of factor VIII. This is what I showed you before. This is a B domain deleted factor VIII. This is A and C domains of recombinant factor VIII. And these little knobs and tubes are decorating the molecule. These are the post-translational modifications, and I want to draw your attention particularly. First are these little green knobs, and these little green knobs, these are called glycosylations or glycans. These glycans are important because we know that non-human glycans can be immunogenic. Immunogenic means they can stimulate the immune system potentially to produce an inhibitor. The other thing I want to draw your attention to are these round circles with an S. The S stands for sulfur, and these are sulfated structures on amino acids in the factor VIII protein. Why is this important? Because proper sulfation is critical for binding of von Willebrand factor, which is a carrier protein for factor VIII. So it affects both the stability of factor VIII and, again, potentially the immune response to factor VIII. So these if some of you haven't muted your microphones, please do so we don't get feedback here. So proper glycosylation and sulfation is essential to normal function of factor VIII. So now, finally, we're going to come to Nuwiq. With that background, I'm going to talk to you about Nuwiq. What is it? It's a third-generation B domain deleted. I showed you that the B domain is a non-functional domain on factor VIII. It's a human cell line-derived recombinant factor VIII concentrate. Now, the summary of the characteristics are shown here. So Nuwiq, which is, after all, used for humans with hemophilia, is produced in cells of human origin. The cells are called HEK. It stands for human embryonic kidney cells. And by the way, this is not the only product produced in HEK cells. Eloctate, which is the longer-acting factor VIII produced by Biogen, is also produced in HEK cells. These are the only two products which are
using them.
The post-translational modifications in Nuwiq are comparable to those seen in plasma-derived, that is, natural factor VIII. Specifically, Nuwiq lacks hamster-derived non-human glycans. Remember, those are those little green knobs I showed you, and it is fully sulfated. And the production process of Nuwiq is free of additives of human or animal origin, and it is exposed, as all factor VIII recombinant products are, it's exposed to a solvent detergent viral inactivation step and to a very fine filtration step. So the pore size of this filter is 21 billionths of a meter, and this is to remove any viruses that might get into the process, although it's recombinant and no viruses have ever been found to, or serious viruses have ever been found to contaminate recombinant factor VIII. Now, back to this question of those little green knobs and glycosylation, what this shows is that these HEK cells, in which Nuwiq and Eloctate are both produced, have a human type of glycosylation, and this is the structure of the human glycosylation on factor VIII. And that's different from the glycosylation that is produced by these two types of cells, and these are the two types of cells that other factor VIII concentrates are produced in. And these are both hamster cells, Chinese hamster ovary cells and baby hamster kidney cells. So both of these have different glycosylations, which are different from the human cell line that is used to produce Nuwiq. And this shows, remember the other thing that I told you to pay attention to is sulfation, and what this shows, this is called a chromatogram, and it shows that various other products that you may be familiar with, Advate, Cogenate, Refacto, all show some degree of non-sulfation, in other words, non-human type structures, poorly sulfated amino acids, whereas in Nuwiq, this is the human cell line, factor VIII now called Nuwiq, there is no detectable unsulfated factor VIII. So it's a very natural human-looking product. Now, I'm going to show you some data on Nuwiq, on actual clinical use from the clinical trials. But before I do, I just want to make sure you understand the terminology, because I'm going to be using these terms, and I think a lot of doctors, let alone people who don't have a medical background, can be confused by them. And it's important you understand the difference between the mean and the median. So this is a group of data. It doesn't matter what they are. Let's say it's ages or whatever. Any group of data, you can look at all these, and you can look at the mean, and the mean is the average. So if you add them all up and divide by the number of events, in this case it's 9, the mean or average is 47. Mean and average are synonyms. It's the same thing. What's the median? The median means that half of the events are below this middle point, so there's 4 numbers below it, and there's 4 numbers above it. So the median is smack in the middle, but it's different from the mean. In this case, they're very close, 47 for the mean and 43 for the median. Now, here's another set of numbers, and you can see the lower 4 numbers are identical to the top 4, but there's more spread at the top 4 numbers here. So if we look at the mean and median of this set of numbers, the median is exactly the same. It's 43, but the mean is more than twice as high. It's 92. So that's just so you understand a little bit the difference between the average or mean and median. So I hope I haven't confused you, but you're going to see these terms, and you see them all the time when you look at data for factor concentrates. So I think it's important to understand that a little bit. So let's now turn to the characteristics of Nuwiq. So what about pharmacokinetics? That means how is it handled in the body when you inject it? And you're familiar with a lot of these terms. You're familiar with the term half-life of factor VIII concentrates. And the data for Nuwiq showed that in adult and adolescent patients, 22 individuals, the mean half-life was 17.1 hours. That's the average. The median was 13.7 hours. Now, to give you some context, these numbers are pretty darn good. What we usually say for factor VIII, for plasma-derived factor VIII, is that the mean or average half-life is going to be about 12 hours. So this is a little bit better than we consider to be a good half-life for factor VIII. Recovery means how much of it is actually recovered per unit per kilo infused, and this is pretty much dead on what we get with most factor concentrates. So I won't dwell on that too much. If we look at children, this is a study that was done in 26 children, and the mean half-life in children was a little less than it was in adults, 12.5 hours. Pretty similar in younger ages and older children. Now, what's the significance of this? Again, to give you some context, we always see poorer half-lives with factor VIII and factor IX in children than we do in adults. And it's because of the different amounts of body fat and the different amounts of fluid in the bodies of children and adults. So a half-life of 12.5 hours in children, again, is pretty good and is better than many concentrates that we've used to date. And the recovery, again, typically it's always a little worse in children than adults, but compared to other products, this is not too bad at all. So these pharmacokinetic characteristics of Nuwiq compare very favorably to pretty much any standard factor VIII on the market. Now, this is not a longer-acting factor VIII, so this is less than we see with the first long-acting we have in Canada, which is Eloctate, but it's certainly very good compared to the other standard factor VIII products like Cogenate, Covaltry, Advate, and Zinta. So let's talk now about prophylaxis. So this is a personalized prophylaxis study done with Nuwiq, and this is the way the study was done. They took 66 adults who had severe hemophilia, less than 1% factor VIII, and they treated them for the first 3 months with what's typically called standard prophylaxis. That is, they got 30 to 40 units per kilogram, so the average adult, it would be about between 2,000 and 3,000 units of Nuwiq, and they got that either every day or 3 times a week. That's standard prophylaxis. After that period, they were switched to a different regimen, which was called personalized prophylaxis, and that was based on their own pharmacokinetic results. In other words, on their own personal half-life. Now, first of all, why was that important, and what was the result? Well, it was important when you look at this very interesting graph. This shows the half-lives of each individual. So each green bar represents one person in the study. And look at this. When you look at the half-lives, the mean, the average, was right about in here. It's about 15 hours. But look at the huge spread. Look up here. There was this whole group of patients had a half-life greater than 20 hours. If you fall into this group, you can hang on to your factor VIII very well. You've got between 20 and even 30 hours half-life. And look at this group, though. If you fall in here, your half-life is very short. It's less than 10 hours. So the average is 15, but the average doesn't mean anything when it comes down to the individual. So in this personalized prophylaxis study, what was done was based on your individual value, where you lay on this curve, they designed a prophylactic schedule for you. So how did that shake out in the end? Well, it turned out that this is the number of people who were on these different schedules. So about 60% of patients actually ended up needing twice a week or even less frequent doses. Some people, 3 people, were only treated every 5 days because they had a very, very long half-life of factor VIII. On the other hand, 2 of them had to be treated every 2 days. Again, the median was twice a week, 3.5, which is the same thing as saying every 3.5 days, which is a pretty good schedule because most people now are on more than twice a week schedule. So what did personalized prophylaxis end up doing? Well, it ended up giving these results. The annualized bleeding rate, meaning the average number of bleeds in an average 12-month interval, was very low, 1.45. The median, remember the difference between mean and median, the median was 0. And in fact, about 3/4 of patients had 0 bleeds. And not only that, because they personalized prophylaxis, they found that these people used 8% less factor VIII than they had used on standard prophylaxis. Remember, that was either every day or 3 times a week. And if they had followed the calculations more exactly, in other words, if they had had maybe more vial sizes or they actually discarded some of the vial, if they had followed it mathematically, they would have actually used 21% less factor VIII. So personalized prophylaxis allows a great many people to use a less onerous, less difficult infusion schedule and to be more conservative of factor VIII use than on a standard sort of blind factor VIII schedule using what we consider to be averages. Now, let's turn back to the children. This is actually the data that I showed you before. I showed you the half-life in children. There are 2 curves here, but don't worry about that. That's just 2 different assays for measuring factor VIII. This shows a pharmacokinetic curve, and what it shows is that the average half-life in these 26 children, again, the number I showed you before, was 12.5 hours. And it was very similar for children in the youngest age group, 2 to 5, and those older children aged 6 to 12. The average recovery, again, was very good compared to other products. Now, there was also a prophylaxis study done in previously treated children. So this is the same kind of study that was done in the adult group. They took 59 children. They were aged between 2 and 12. They had severe hemophilia A, and they all received in this study a standard prophylactic regimen. That was 30 to 40 units per kilogram of Nuwiq, given either every other day or 3 times a week. And the main result was the average number of annualized bleeds was 4.1 with a median of about 2, but most of those bleeds were not spontaneous. Most of them were due to injury, you know, little kids running around and falling down and bumping themselves and playing sports. When you look at the number of spontaneous bleeds, it was very low. The average in a 12-month period was 1.5, and the median, again, was 0. No inhibitors developed, and there were no serious adverse events. Now, we wouldn't really expect inhibitors because these were previously treated children and they'd never had an inhibitor before. So that's certainly a good result, but we wouldn't have expected it. So what we're really interested in when it comes to inhibitor safety is, well, what's the inhibitor risk in people who have never been treated? What we call previously untreated patients, which is abbreviated as PUPs, P-U-Ps. So this was a study sponsored by the company, Biocta Pharma, called the Immunogenicity, Efficacy, and Safety of Treatment with Human Cell Line Recombinant Human Factor VIII in previously untreated patients, that is PUPs, with severe hemophilia. Now, this study isn't finished. It's still ongoing. But they did present interim results. Those of you who are at the WFH meeting in Orlando may have heard these data, so it was presented publicly, so that's why I can share it with you. They presented the interim results of this study. And what we're particularly interested in is the rate of inhibitor development in these PUP studies. So this is what was presented. It was presented at one of the lunch symposia by one of the UK investigators at the WFH meeting. So the interim results in the study was called Nuwiq, and these are the data. So there were 85 treated PUPs, previously untreated young children, and this was the first interim analysis. It was analyzed in May and presented in July. So 66 of these children have had over 20 exposure days, that is, days in which they received factor VIII, either 1 or more times. And why 20 or more exposure days? Because most inhibitors, if they're going to develop, are going to develop within 20 exposure days. Not all of them. Some will develop later, but most will develop within 20 exposure days. So of these 66 young children, 13 have developed inhibitors. That's about 21% of the total. And I'll give you some context for these numbers in a moment. So about 20% to 21% developed inhibitors. 8 of them were high titers, so that's about 13% of these young children developed high titer inhibitors. And they occurred at a median of 10 exposure days, and so far only 2 of them have developed after 20 days. Now, so we don't know if this incidence rate will hold up, but it's very encouraging. Now, why do I say it's encouraging? Well, let's compare it to other studies. Now, these are not necessarily fair comparisons, but we want to get just a context of what does that mean when we say 18 or 28% or 13%. Well, when we look at inhibitors in the SIPET study that I referred to you, that I told you about earlier, plasma-derived factor VIII, which many people consider to be the safest factor VIII, the inhibitor incidence was about 27%. Recombinant factor VIII, it was quite high, it was over 44%. And what did I just tell you about Nuwiq? It was about 21%. So fewer than even fewer than plasma-derived numbers in the SIPET study. That's for all inhibitors. And when you look at high titer inhibitors, the same trend. It was about 19% in the SIPET study with plasma-derived factor VIII, 28% for recombinant factor VIII in the SIPET study, and only 13% in the Nuwiq study. Now, these comparisons, you can't take these too far. You've got to use extreme caution in interpreting these. So the data are encouraging, but I want you to keep these things in mind. First of all, patients in different studies are different. They have different ethnicity, different geographic origins, different backgrounds. They have different treatment patterns, and they have different risk factors. So, for example, in the SIPET study, over 40% of patients in both arms were treated on demand, and we think that perhaps prophylactic treatment reduces the inhibitor risk. Furthermore, in the SIPET study, fewer than 40% of the patients were white, and almost 3/4 were from 3 countries, Iran, Egypt, and India. Now, in this Nuwiq study that I showed you, a much higher proportion of the individuals were white, and we know that, for example, blacks have a higher incidence of inhibitors than do white people. And furthermore, the geographic origin was different. Most of the patients in the Nuwiq study were from Eastern and Western Europe and from Canada, as opposed to these countries for the SIPET study. So different populations. Not only that, but the SIPET study, since it was complete, and in fairness, the Nuwiq data aren't complete yet, most of them had more exposure, that is 50 exposure days. Most of the SIPET patients who used recombinant factor VIII used first and second generation concentrates, whereas, of course, Nuwiq is a third generation product. There was no comparison arm. It's not designed that way in the Nuwiq study, so we can't compare these directly. And not only that, but those inhibitor numbers that I showed you in SIPET, those were pretty high compared to historical standards. So for all these reasons, I'm not telling you that Nuwiq has a lesser inhibitor risk than the concentrates used in the SIPET study. What I'm saying is that so far, these results are very encouraging. Those are pretty low numbers for inhibitors, and if they hold up, this is going to be a very favorable product. So I'm going to end now, and I just want to let you know that we're talking today only about this one product, Nuwiq. If you're interested in seeing a presentation, a web-based presentation on all the new factor products that are available in Canada, that is outside of Quebec, then you're welcome to visit the website of our Hemophilia Treatment Center at St. Michael's. So if you just go to the St. Michael's Hospital website, and this is the URL, and if you go to the different programs, you can make your way to the hemophilia program, and you'll find the presentation that shows you the characteristics of all the different products that are now available. So at your convenience, I would invite you to do that, and that might help you when you're approaching the product switches that many of you are going to have to do in the coming weeks and months. So with that, Matthew, I will end my presentation, and I will turn it back to you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Tuttle, and and I hope you'll stay with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just for a few minutes of Q&A. But we first would like to hear from Edgar Martinez, and Edgar's a person in the United States with hemophilia, and will join us to share just a part of his story around hemophilia and the journey that he's had with his care.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for presenting that information, and thank you for giving me the time to tell my story. Michael, just a quick question. Do you have my presentation?
We do. Just one moment.
Okay.
There we go, Edgar.
So thank you so much, Michael. Once again, thank you, everybody, for giving me the time. I just want to share a quick brief history of my journey with hemophilia. Once again, my name is Edgar Martinez. I do live in Jacksonville, Florida, and I just once again want to thank you guys. Can I get the next slide, Michael? I can't control it. So a few of my disclosures. I am a consultant for Octapharma USA in Hoboken, New Jersey. This presentation represents my individual personal experience living with hemophilia A and is not a commercially focused discussion. And third, please always consult with your local hemophilia treatment center physician if you have any questions related to the management of bleeding disorders after this presentation. Next slide, Michael. So in the early years, for me, I was born in the United States Virgin Islands in 1985. There was very little known about bleeding disorders in the United States Virgin Islands when I was born. I was not diagnosed for that reason until I was 10 years old living in Orlando, Florida. And my family does not have a history of any sort of bleeding disorders anywhere down the line. Next slide. So before prophylaxis, when I was first diagnosed, my physician at my hemophilia treatment center and I decided to start off my therapy on-demand treatment for bleeds. I was having multiple bleeds annually. I was visiting my hemophilia treatment center more frequently than most patients that were on a prophylaxis treatment. And I missed out, more importantly, on a lot of childhood activities. As you can see there, I used to love to play basketball, ride bikes with most of my friends. So because of my higher annualized bleed rate, I was definitely missing out on a lot of my childhood. Next, please. So at the age of 16, I got transitioned over into a prophylaxis treatment. I started off on an earlier generation recombinant factor, dosing every other day, but I was still having about 6 to 8 breakthrough bleeds a year. Part of that was due to attending culinary school, being on my feet about 15 hours a day, so I was still having a lot of breakthrough bleeding. This limited me not only to miss class, but it also limited me to pursue my dreams. I've always wanted to be a chef. I grew up cooking with my mother in the kitchen every day, every Thanksgiving. When people would come over, I'd always be in the kitchen. I learned a lot of my mother's recipes, so I really had a passion for cooking. And also, since we do live in Florida, we have Walt Disney World in our backyard, so we love going to Walt Disney World. We love spending the whole day in the parks, riding the rides, seeing the shows. But I was having a lot of complications. I was still having a lot of breakthrough bleeds due to that, and I was actually having to infuse extra doses not only before, but also after my trips to Walt Disney World. Next slide. So I transitioned over to Nuwiq personally 6 months ago, and I've had great success. I am currently only treating twice a week, and now I'm able to visit Walt Disney World with my family. As you can see in that picture, that's my wife, my daughter, and myself. And I'm able to visit Walt Disney World now without having to infuse any extra doses. And I also coach high school football on the side with no concerns of any breakthrough bleedings due to my regular dosing. Once again, you know, every treatment plan is going to be different, and we always ask that you consult your hemophilia treatment center. And once again, I thank you guys for your time. I know your time is valuable, and Doctor, once again, thank you for presenting.
Thank you, Edgar. We'll now open up the telephone line for people to ask questions. Does anyone have any questions?
You're stupid.
Well, Dr. Title, maybe I'll ask just one quick question again, just as you went through.
Yep.
And so, how is Nuwiq different than a plasma-derived product?
Well, first of all, it is. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good. Okay. You know, it is not derived from plasma at all. It's like any other recombinant. It is a genetically engineered factor VIII, but any factor VIII has to be either collected from plasma or produced in some kind of cell that is capable of making that molecule and modifying it the way I showed you. So the goal with Nuwiq was to make it look as much like plasma-derived factor VIII as possible. As I told you, making the stringing the beads together, the amino acid beads, which is the backbone of the protein together, that's the less difficult part, and many cells can do that. The more difficult part was to make it make the modifications to look as human as possible. So some products are being deliberately modified. So, for example, eloctate, which I referred to, is linked to another protein called FC to prolong its activity. There are other approaches to deliberately modify the protein. What Nuwiq is designed to do is to look as much like human factor VIII as possible. Now, nothing produced in an animal cell, even a human cell in a laboratory in a big fermentation vat, is going to look exactly like what comes out of a plasma donor. So the goal, though, with Nuwiq is to make it look as human as possible, and compared to other products that we've been using, it is more human-like in these characteristics. So that's a bit of a roundabout way of answering your question, but the goal, Matthew, is to make this look as human as possible, and from the data that they've shown, I think they've achieved that pretty well.
Okay, thank you.
I should say, by the way, on a different topic, it's interesting to hear that Edgar is from the Virgin Islands, one of the most beautiful places on Earth, so you certainly grew up around great beauty, Edgar.
I sure did, Doc. I've been really blessed to live in some beautiful places, and my home is the U.S. Virgin Islands in my heart. So.
Right.
And Edgar, I just thought I'd ask you a question about. Dr. Title talked about the prophylaxis regime. How did you come to be treating twice a week?
So when I decided to switch over to Nuwiq, I met with my hematologist at my hemophilia treatment center. We definitely discussed, you know, the science behind it a little bit, and we did a PK study on me when I switched over to make sure that my half-life was indicative of what the dosing should be. So once we did the PK study, we found that I can dose twice a week. And my factor levels stay high enough where it still protects me.
Okay. Well, and Dr. Title, a PK study is what?
So that's a pharmacokinetic study, and that's what I was showing you. And I showed you that personalized PK or pharmacokinetic study. That's exactly what Edgar had done, and that's what we're going to be encouraging everyone to do at our Hemophilia Treatment Center and other centers, and that is to personalize care. So, you know, conventionally, we wouldn't think that twice a week is a very good schedule for factor VIII, but Edgar was able to find out that based on his PK, meaning the half-life and recovery of factor VIII when he injected it in his own vein, that he was able to get away with twice-a-week treatment, and many patients are able to get away with it. But if you happen to have a shorter half-life, that's not going to be a very good schedule for you. So personalized PK, as I tried to show you, allows us to rationalize treatment for every individual because, you know, we're all different. The way we handle factor VIII differs for many different reasons, and by personalizing care, you can get better treatment, and in many cases, less intensive treatment. Now, the Nuwiq is a good example as well of a product which has a pretty good mean and median PK characteristics, better than some other products out there, which is why a lot of patients on this product are able to treat twice a week. Now, other products are showing the same thing, to be fair. So the new Bayer product, Covaltry, which is going to be replacing Cogenate, is also going to be labeled for twice-a-week dosing in many patients. And certainly the deliberately long-acting modified product, Lactate, is typically used not more than twice a week. So a lot of people are going to be able to go to twice-a-week dosing, but it really should ideally be based on your personalized personalized PK, which can be done relatively easy now. We used to have to take, you know, 10 or 12 samples over 48 hours to get a good PK curve. There are other ways of doing it now in which we can take as few as 3 or 4 samples over 12 or 24 hours, ideally, if it's someone who can come back the next day and get really good PK data to allow us to individualize and personalize your schedule.
Great, thank you. Well, just again, if there's any questions from other participants. Then I have just one other question around, and again, it's, you know, often when we get studies presented to us about inhibitors, it's often showing us with pups or children. And so what's the risk of adults actually developing inhibitors?
Well, you raised an important point, Matthew. First of all, inhibitors can develop at any time in life. So you never want to say that an adult is completely free of the risk of an inhibitor. An adult, though, who has severe hemophilia and has had treatment for many years, that would be extraordinarily rare for that individual to ever develop an inhibitor. So when we see adults who develop an inhibitor, it's usually something different. It's usually an adult who has non-severe hemophilia and who has been only lightly treated over the years. And these situations are coming up more and more as people with hemophilia are living longer and longer. So, for example, a typical situation, this is something that this is not made up. This is something that I've seen and many of us have seen. We had an older gentleman with mild hemophilia who had needed cardiac surgery a year or so ago. He'd had very little factor VIII over the years. He needed lots of factor VIII in a short time to cover the cardiac surgery, and he went and developed an inhibitor. And we were able to get rid of it, fortunately, but that's not always the case. So when adults develop an inhibitor, it's more likely to be someone who doesn't have severe hemophilia and has had little factor VIII. Occasionally, we'll see an adult who hasn't been lucky enough to be in a position where he could be treated. So, for example, someone coming from a developing country where he didn't have access to factor VIII comes to Canada or the United States where he gets factor VIII, and essentially he's like a previously untreated patient, so he's a big pup, so to speak. So, but people with severe hemophilia who develop inhibitors, as I told you in the presentation, usually develop it within about their first 20 days of exposure to factor VIII. Certainly at the outside, it's about 50 days. And if you've got severe hemophilia, you're going to get those 20 or 50 days within the first couple of years of life. So if you've got severe hemophilia and you haven't developed an inhibitor after the first few years, you're likely out of the woods.
Great. Again, I'd like to thank both Dr. Teitel and Edgar for being with us this evening, and look forward to being able to share. This presentation has been recorded, and so will be made available shortly online, so that, again, those that weren't able to be with us tonight are able to take advantage of it in the future. Again, thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening. And again, thank you, Dr. Teitel, and thank you, Edgar, for being with us today.
Okay, thanks for organizing it, Matthew. Good night, everyone.